In this installment of our analysis on Super Mario RPG's level design, we'll start with Seaside Town and go all the way to the end of the game. Seaside Town is where I consider the dividing line between the lighter first half of the game and the more intense second half. The Sunken Ship in particular can be a really tough go the first time. This area relies on a password challenge. You can get 6 hints for the password, each of which is hidden behind a battle and a unique puzzle. This password is always the same, so if you're on your second playthrough, you can skip 6 rooms and 6 battles in here, making it a pretty straightforward dungeon. This is still one of the largest areas in the game though, and you'll discover how mentally taxing it can be once you try to get to the third clue and enter the dreaded 3D maze. In all fairness, the concept of a 3D maze in an isometric world is a great one. This is one of those few places where the game breaks the fourth wall by giving you an out if you're stuck. The open areas are a nice touch for providing some perspective, but I always had trouble with the area, and looking at the solution, I'm surprised my younger self ever figured this out. Luckily, it's totally optional, and again, you really only have to do it the first time you play the game, since the password doesn't change. None of the other puzzle rooms are nearly as challenging as the maze. Now it's time to enter the password. If you have all the clues, you'll still have to think about it a little bit, because the word is scrambled. The answer is pearls, by the way. After one more boss fight and a few more battle rooms, you'll fight Johnny for the next star piece. Now I want to skip forward a little bit to Monster Town, where the game's hidden super boss Culex can be challenged. Super bosses are typically hidden away in RPGs, and Culex is likewise waiting for you behind this sealed door. Opening the door is actually quite cryptic. You need to buy a seemingly useless shiny stone from Moleville, but the vendor doesn't appear until after you've gone through the coal mines. At first glance, this item appears to be useless, and there's nothing in the game that explicitly contradicts this, but if you kept it in your inventory between Moleville and Monster Town, you can use it to unlock the door. You can actually sell the stone for 2 coins, which is a low enough price that you probably won't sell it. The low selling price is a tactic used in other RPGs as well, and it's a way to subtly discourage you from getting rid of the shiny stone, increasing your chances of having your mind blown when you open this door. There's yet another unique one-time mechanic here in Monster Town. You can see this key up on the ledge, but there's no way to access it. If you go to the house below, you can talk to the Thwomp, who will always do this. If you do it a few times, which is hinted at by the Thwomp's several lines of unique dialogue, you'll knock the key down outside to access Belom's treasure room. Even if you didn't intend to knock the key down, talking to this Thwomp twice will catch you off guard, because most NPCs only have a single line of dialogue at any given time. This is a great way to introduce this new mechanic so late in the game. The developers have thrown in an out-of-place element at a point where most players believe they've figured out the rules of the in-game universe. Monster Town is already one huge example of throwing something unexpected at the player, so the falling key mechanic kind of blends right in and feels like a natural addition to me. Bean Valley requires some vine climbing, which is made easier due to the straightforward placement of the vines along the isometric axis. It's very important that the depth between vines is clear here, to avoid adding artificial difficulty and player frustration with the jumps. And since the vines are so tall, you won't really be able to rely on shadows here to correct your jumps. You'll also grab a seed, which has no use yet, but we'll come back to that soon. Nimbus Land is a fun, if unremarkable area. It's clever that some of the statues will come to life to attack you just the same way that you pretended to be a statue in order to enter the castle. There's also this completely invisible path that leads to a frog coin, but it actually serves a hugely important function for getting the lazy shell. As far as I know, this path on the Nimbus Land map is the only other invisible platform in the game, and you're unlikely to find it unless you're actively exploring every possible inch of the area. This is why the invisible path inside the castle can be useful in setting the precedent that such other paths might exist, which just might lead you to discover how to get the ingredients for the lazy shell. Let's jump to the Barrel Volcano, which should remind you of the bridge spanning the game's very first area. But now you can fall in the lava, so this is a serious step up in difficulty. Hopefully you practiced on the Donut Bridge in Land's End, because the jumps here can be pretty tricky, especially if you want to grab the treasure lying around. There are a lot of enemy encounters here, and most of them are pretty tough. By this point, you should be doing well with timed hits and blocks, so the difficulty increase should be apparent to you, but also manageable. As you go to nab the Power Star, it'll be snatched away by the Axum Rangers, and you'll begin an ascent to the top of the volcano to fight them. Even though you can't actually fail this chase segment, the music and tension of the situation make it exciting to play. This is a great thing, because if you could actually fail this section and be forced back to the last save point, all the excitement this scene elicits would be replaced by frustration. Now we arrive at the final area of the game. This is the Gauntlet. Consecutive battles, super challenging platforming, and some fairly tricky puzzles await us here. Even worse, the numbered doors are randomly connected to the challenges, so you'll have to be ready for anything, even if it's not your first time through. This Gauntlet is a great way to top off the experiences you've had so far, because it focuses on the 3 primary aspects of the game: platforming, fighting, and puzzles. You might have serious problems judging your jumps here in the platforming sections, due to the many moving blocks. Just past this area, you'll also find the infinite coin block before venturing into the final dungeon, the factory. I never stopped to think about it before, but I almost wish that Exor were the game's final boss. I mean, he's one of the most iconic parts of the game's storytelling, but he really only guards the final dungeon. Conversely, we haven't even seen Smithy, which might seem like an unusual way to present your game's major antagonist. But the more I thought about why this is, the more I started to appreciate not showing Smithy until the final battle. You've been fighting Smithy's creations throughout the entire game, but you have no idea what to expect when you confront him. You don't know what he looks like, or even what he is, but by defeating all of Smithy's creations, you feel like you've grown strong enough to be worthy of confronting him. At the same time, many other characters are aware of Smithy's existence, but we as the player are in the dark. This generates a fear of the unknown that can hang over you, kind of like how nobody in the Harry Potter universe will say the name Voldemort. The images and ideas in our minds are usually much more frightening than the reality, and this tension makes Smithy seem even more menacing. The factory is awesome. It's longer than most of the other dungeons, and the unusual color-muted aesthetic really clashes with the rest of the game and makes it feel appropriately otherworldly. The whole thing feels at once utilitarian like a factory should feel, and unnerving like a final dungeon should feel. Conveyor belts and nuts and bolts scattered around are really clever ways of integrating the level's theme into the platforming. The industrial soundtrack also does a great job of supporting the unsettling imagery, all leading up to the final battle. In general, Mario RPG's level design is at its strongest in areas that rely on verticality. Let me clarify that. Safe verticality. If missing a jump means getting sent back a screen or having to do a section over, that's the kind of frustration we want to avoid. But here's the prime example of safe verticality. Booster Tower has a lot of staircases that you can't fall off of, and only a few jumps where an error will send you back. This is isometric platforming done right. But in areas like the final Gauntlet platforming sections, it can be a little frustrating to jump between moving blocks with very little for your eyes to anchor your position to. It's sort of like playing a beat-em-up and going to attack the enemy, only to realize you're just a few pixels higher and thus on a completely different horizontal plane. You might very well mess up the platforming sections because you can't rely on your shadow, and missing a jump means going back to the beginning, which is discouraging when you feel like there's little you can do to prevent it. The enemy density is also erratic at times, which can interrupt your jolly good time jumping around. In areas like the Sunken Ship, it's nearly impossible to avoid consecutive fights, simply because the rooms are narrow and the enemy sprites are large. Furthermore, enemies have idle animations and may patrol a certain area, and they may have a chase behavior once you've gotten close enough. I still vastly prefer this method over random encounters because it helps the environments come to life, and because it avoids that disruption of focus we mentioned in the last analysis with Star Hill. Enemies will ambush you from unseen hiding places, or may not even notice you if you proceed carefully. Most importantly, this is the developers handing control over to you, the player, over how you encounter enemies, giving you time to heal up or make party changes before your next fight. Now that we've covered all the game's areas, our level design talk is over. The next installment of this analysis will focus on how the game's level design impacts its progression system, namely leveling up, getting more powerful weapons, and how Mario RPG uses these mechanics in unique and interesting ways. Hey there, it's Ed. If you're a fan of the content that we put out on the channel, feel free to subscribe or like or comment or whatever you want. If you'd like to support the channel, we have donation links in the description below. We accept PayPal and Bitcoin. And as always, thank you for your continued support of GameSoup.